What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. George Gervin, George the Iceman Gervin, when I was growing up, was pretty much seen as the greatest pure scorer in the history of the NBA. All right. Now, he didn't have the highest scoring average that belonged to Michael Jordan. He didn't have the most scoring titles that belonged to Jordan. He didn't have the most prolific scoring games that was Will Chamberlain. But when you looked at his arsenal of weapons, um, when you looked at his body type, right, his athleticism combined with his finesse, he had so many advantages that went for him when it comes to scoring. The quickness, the length. He was explosive. He had huge hands. Um, you know, unlike a guy like Julius Erving, who also had huge hands and quickness and strength and length, Gervin had a touch. Julius was not a great shooter. Um, Great athlete, phenomenal athlete, uh, wasn't necessarily a great shooter. George Gervin from 20, I'd say 22 feet in, was a phenomenal shooter. And that's why he draws the comparisons to Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant is in many ways a bigger version of George Gervin with a 3-point shot. You know what I'm saying? An even better overall shooter. But Gervin was no slouch, man. I mean, for his era, unbelievable. Like Kevin Durant, George Gervin was not what you would call a ball hawk. He didn't shoot the ball as much as some other guys. You know what I'm saying? Like Jordan had some seasons where he shot the ball 24, 25 times a game. Um, One particular season, he shot the ball over 27 times a game. I don't think Gervin had more than a handful of seasons shooting the ball 20 times a game. More than likely, he shot the ball between about 17 to 19 times a game. Sort of like Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant is a great scorer, but he's not what you would call um, a shameless scorer. He will play within the offense unless he's having one of those games where he's on and the game dictates that he shoots more, you know, like that 51-point game he had against the Raptors. But more than likely, Durant's going to have an efficient scoring game. Durant's going to go 10 of 19 from the floor. He's going to go maybe 6 of 6 from the foul line. He's going to hit a couple of threes. And that's how he's going to get his 29 points. Uh, Gervin was the same way. But George Gervin was electric. And he was known for a shot that doesn't exist. He's the only one really to perfect it, and that was the finger roll. He shot that shot so well and with such precision and efficiency that sometimes he would even finger roll to the free throw line. You know what I'm saying? I've seen footage of him finger rolling, and I'm like, how the fuck did he make that shot? In all honesty, I thought it was a more difficult shot to master than the sky hook, or even maybe in some ways the fadeaway. To shoot a shot, I'm not talking about near the rim. I've seen him finger roll near the foul line. How the fuck do you make that? Ice Kid, and he was called Iceman for his cool demeanor and for the fact that apparently, no matter how many minutes he played the game and how the no matter what the dynamics of the game was, he didn't seem to sweat out there on the court. You know, but George Gervin was born on April 27th, 1952, in Detroit, Michigan, and he attended Martin Luther King High School. And initially, when he played basketball in high school, Um, he wasn't that particularly good. He was undersized, and um, you know, being that he was undersized, he really couldn't. He wasn't a very efficient player, and he struggled. But fortunately for Ice, sometime I think during his junior year, he had a huge growth spurt. And after this growth spurt, during his senior year, he averaged 31 points and 20 rebounds to lead his school to the state quarterfinals. Afterwards, he was an all state selection by the Detroit Free Press in 1970. Soon afterward, George Gervin received a scholarship to play under coach Jerry Tarkanian, the late great Jerry Tarkanian, at California State University. But due to certain cultural, I guess, realities out there that Gervin didn't feel comfortable with, he returned home soon afterward and transferred to Eastern Michigan University. And there he would average 29.5 points per game as a sophomore in 1971-72. After his collegiate career, he went pro. But at this time, you got to remember, there were two professional leagues, the ABA and the NBA. And this is where my caveat, I need to put this in. Okay. Now, for his NBA career, George Gervin averaged 26.2 points per game, and he scored 20,000, I believe, 880 points. All right, that pushed him just ahead of Bob Pettit overall in scoring in the NBA. But on my channel, I include ABA scoring because it's a professional. This is my reasoning. It's a professional league, okay? So I think it should count the numbers. And the reason why I think the NBA should include the ABA is because the NBA has integrated four former ABA teams. Plus, you've taken one of the most uh, notable ABA ideas, which is 3-point line, and you took that and added it to the NBA. So if the ABA was such an influence and had such a legacy with the NBA, why don't you include the ABA with players that played in the ABA? You know what I'm saying? It's like you're trying to, it kind of reminds me of WWE when they bought out WCW, but they tried to erase whatever WCW did. It doesn't work like that. You know what I'm saying? That's why I include George Gervin's performances, his games with the Virginia Squires and the Spurs when they were in the ABA to his totals. So that's why I don't credit him with 20,880 points. I credit Gervin with 26,595 points. Okay, which puts his scoring average down a little bit because he wasn't just the premier scorer with those teams. Um, I think it puts him down to 25.6 points per game or something like that. But still, he's one of the great scorers in the history of the NBA. Every year he played professionally, he averaged at least 14 points a game. Um, it was when the NBA ABA merger happened that he really began to score at a prolific and unbelievably efficient level. But first, when he arrived in the ABA, he played, interestingly enough, for the Pontiac Chaparrals of the CBA. But then he was bumped up to playing for the Virginia Squires. But this didn't last long because the Virginia Squires, who had already sold Julius Erving, among other players, were struggling financially. And they were often at the misfortune of having to sell one of their uh, high ranking players for cash just to keep afloat. And eventually this included George Gervin. And George Gervin was sold to the Spurs for $230,000. In 1974, George Gervin, was eligible for the NBA draft, and very nearly, he was drafted to the Phoenix Suns. But instead, George Gervin decided to stay and play for the ABA's San Antonio Spurs, and he was soon teamed with forgotten high-scoring forward Larry Keenan. Now, during this time, sometimes some seasons Gervin would play the small forward position, but to me, he was better suited at the shooting guard position. That's where he had his highest scoring seasons later on to come because at 6'7", at that time, 6'7", that was much taller than your average shooting guard. I would say the average shooting guard at that time, I don't know, I'm just guessing off the top of my head, may have been about 6'3", you know. So Gervin had a tremendous height advantage over most shooting guards. And then when he was guarded up against most small forwards to nullify the height differential, then Gervin would use his quickness ability. He was only 185 pounds or so, and he was very quick in during his prime. So he would use his first step to blow by these guys. And the most small forwards at the time were maybe 200 plus pounds by then, so they didn't really have the foot speed or lateral ability to stay with a guy like Gervin. So Gervin was a matchup nightmare when he moved to the shooting guard position. But he was still effective at the small forward position. And, you know, um, the Spurs were one of the better teams in the ABA, but they never were able to win the championship. Now, after the ABA NBA merger, the Spurs were one of four teams, the other ones being, I believe, the Pacers, the Nuggets, and I think the Nets, to move over to the NBA. And it was there from the late 70s into the early 1980s that George Gervin was the premier scorer in the NBA. You know, he would go on to win scoring titles in 77, 78, 78, 79, 79, 80, and the one last one in 81, 82. The 77, 78 scoring title was the most dramatic one in terms of the closeness. It was the closest scoring race in the history of the NBA. We've had some close scoring races. 1998 was close. I remember that one between Michael Jordan and Shaquille O'Neal. 1993-94 was very close between, um, I believe that was between David Robinson and Shaquille O'Neal. Um, but the one in 77, 78 was unbelievably close. And it looked like David Thompson had it wrapped up. He scored, I believe, 53 points in the first half against the Detroit Pistons. Unbelievable scoring barrage. He wound up with 73 points that night. If he wanted to, Thompson could have easily scored 90 points that game if he wanted to. But he pretty much rested the second half because he thought the 73 points would be more than enough to capture the scoring championship. Look, no matter how great a scorer you are, you don't just routinely come out and just score 50 points at will. Um, Gervin needed 58 points because his team hadn't played yet that day. He needed to score 58 points to overtake Thompson. So he went out gunning that game. He went out just ablazing. And initially he was on fire, but you know what I'm saying? He started forcing the issue a little bit with that, with as far as like shooting the ball. And he wound up with 63 points that game, including 33 points in the second quarter. And he overtook David Thompson in scoring 27.22 to 27.15 points per game. The next year, I believe he averaged 29.6 points per game. So he upped the scoring for the 78-79 season. And then the 79-80 season, he averaged a career high 33, I believe, .1 points per game. So he was scoring at an unbelievable clip during the 1980 season. But what was even more remarkable about that was his shooting percentage. He was routinely shooting well over 50% from the floor, 52%, 53% from the floor, even up to 54% from the floor in some seasons. And it was just because at that time he had just mastered the art of scoring. You know what I'm saying? He scored most of his points in the paint or in the mid range. And he was efficient, like I said. Um, some critics actually said that sometimes maybe Gervin was too efficient. And by that I mean he wasn't willing to sometimes shoot over double teams. You know what I'm saying? Like I've read this since I've done this top 10. I think it was 7 years ago. I've read that some people said that Gervin sometimes was maybe too concerned about his field goal percentage, and that he wouldn't gun in some particular playoff games, and that might be why sometimes in the playoffs he could be shut down because he didn't want to force the issue. Like a guy like Michael, Kobe, some of these other guys, they're not concerned about numbers. So sometimes, you know what I'm saying, they don't give a fuck if they shoot 9 for 28, as long as they win, you know. I don't know. I don't know if that's true with Gervin or not. I don't know. I haven't watched enough games with him to make that determination. But it is what it is. I know that George Gervin, unfortunately, played in the era where they were just better teams. For instance, he played against the Lakers after the Spurs moved from the Eastern Conference to the Western Conference in the early 1980s. He had to contend against the Lakers. Nobody was going to beat that team. Um, so at the end of the day, the Spurs were, even after they acquired Artis Gilmore, they were a really good team. They would often win about 50 games a year, but they just didn't have enough to get past certain teams, and in particular the Lakers. You know, by the mid, going into the late 1980s, George Gervin, at that time, getting into his mid 30s, was finally beginning to slow down. Um, I think it was after the 1945 season. He was, I believe, released by the Spurs. I think he was released, not traded. Not sure about that. But I believe he was released by, the Spurs, and he was acquired by the Chicago Bulls during the offseason '85. Michael Jordan, who at that time was a rising star with Chicago, was not happy with that selection. Probably because of, I'm assuming because of a couple of reasons. Number one, Gervin was one of the players supposedly involved in the supposed freeze out of Jordan in the '85 All-Star game. And number two, if you're Michael Jordan, and if you're, you know, in his position, you're wondering why the Chicago Bulls are picking a guard pretty much that brings, not saying everything that you bring to the table, but they're basically picking a guy that's a shooting guard, that's a scorer, and you're wondering what's going on. Like, are they trying to, you know, have me share scoring, playing time with this guy, or I guess Jordan felt like the Bulls needed something else. But ultimately, it chose to be a wise move because Michael would break his foot that season, and George Gervin, although he wasn't the same player anymore, he did average 16 points a game that year, and he helped to fill the hole to an extent that was left from 64 games missed by Jordan due to the foot injury. The last game George Gervin ever played in the NBA was the 63-point game that Michael had against the Boston Celtics. I think Gervin only played about 5 minutes that game and was credited with an assist to Jordan in that particular game. That's the last game that George Gervin ever played. After that season, George Gervin went overseas and played a couple of years in Europe. In Italy for Banca Roma during the 86-87 season, he averaged 26.1 points per game. In the Spanish National Basketball League, and he also played for the Quad City Thunder of the now defunct Continental Basketball Association. Famously, also, when he was overseas, I remember reading about this. George Gervin gained a lot of weight when he went over to Italy. You know, George Gervin was always a guy that was real thin, about 180, 185 pounds, but he went overseas to Italy, and the culture they have with the food, and the pasta, and pizza, he gained something like 40 fucking pounds. He went from being 180 pounds, 185 to about 215, 220. Um, you know, when he played over there, you know, he got kind of stocky. And I do remember that. I do remember when he got kind of big because there was an interview that Michael Jordan did with Gervin. I think it was around '88, and you could clearly see he was a much stockier, bigger dude. Um, and that was because of living over there overseas. So to look at George Gervin's career, he was a 9-time NBA All-Star. All right, 3-time ABA All-Star. Okay, so that's 12-time Pro All-Star. Okay, he was a 1980 All-Star Game MVP. 5 times he was All-NBA First Team. 2 times All-NBA Second Team. He was a 4-time NBA scoring champion. And at the time of his retirement, he had the most scoring titles ever for a shooting guard. That has since been supplanted by Michael Jordan, of course, and I believe Allen Iverson ties him too for second among shooting guards. His number 44 was retired by the San Antonio Spurs. He was on the ABA All Rookie First Team in 1973 and twice All ABA Second Team. He was on the 50th Anniversary All Time Team, and he's on the ABA All Time Team, which goes to show he's one of the greatest ABA players in the history of the American Basketball Association. He scored 26,595 points, pulled down 5,602 rebounds, and he dished out 2,798 assists. All right, that's an average of 25.1 points per game when you include the ABA, 5.3 rebounds, and 2.6 assists per game. There's one other thing I want to add about George Gervin too. Now, George Gervin is not noted for being a great defensive player. However, he was the first shooting guard in pro basketball history to register 100 blocks in the season. And until Michael Jordan supplanted him, all right, and then later after Dwayne Wade passed Jordan, George Gervin was the all-time leader in block shots for a shooting guard for many years. All right, I think he's still like third, if I'm not mistaken, third or fourth in that category. So even though Gervin wasn't known for being a great defensive player, he was a prolific shot blocker for his position. All right. So that's it. You know what I'm saying? There are gonna be some people that think maybe I'm ranking him too low, but then you gotta look at the people who I have ahead of him, and when you look at their resumes, they may not be as prolific a scorer, but they have some things over him. And at the end of the day, I do think championships matter. Okay. The fact that Sam Jones has 10 of them, even if you could consider the era, still means something, which is why I have him in the top 10. You know what I'm saying? Even though it wasn't an era of free agency you still got to put some, importance upon that. So at the end of the day, I have George Gervin at number 7 all time for shooting guards. Tell me what you guys think.